New tabletop RPGs are fighting for visibility in an overgrown marketplace, so it's time for designers to innovate. And a game called Mörk Borg might have some answers. Oz, give us an overview. What is Mörk Borg, and why do you think tabletop RPG developers should be taking notice?
All right, so Mörk Borg is a rules light apocalyptic death metal fantasy tabletop RPG. And I have so many good things to say about it without having even played it yet, from its light rules to its GM friendly dungeon mapping to its presentation. I mean, this game is practically an art book screaming for you to pay attention to it. But the reason I wanted to talk about this game is because of the developer's approach to third-party content, because similar to games like Apocalypse World, Blades in the Dark, and Fate, Mörk Borg has allowed anyone, and that even you, to create stuff for the game itself, or just create your own things using its rules, then publish it, or even make money from it without them taking a cut. So on the game's website, mörkborg.com, they have a very visible and easy to comprehend third-party license detailing some simple rules of what is and is not allowed. Now, this isn't anything new. Like I've said, other games have done similar with fantastic results. It feels like we've seen hundreds of games that are powered by the apocalypse or forged in the dark. And these third-party licenses have empowered designers to create entirely new games under their flags. And that in turn drives sales to the original game that planted that flag, keeping those games relevant while also allowing the system to flourish. Take a look at this report of campaigns played in Roll20 during the Q2 of 2020. If you combine the Apocalypse World systems being played with those of Dungeon World games, and the reason I'm doing that is because I'm not sure why Dungeon World is counted separately, since they're all powered by the Apocalypse, that places PBTA games at 0.90%, which may not seem like a lot in comparison to D&D's massive 53%, but it places it firmly between the incredibly popular IPs of Starfinder and the entirety of World of Darkness. Now, mind you, the full report shows even more games that fall under the PBTA flags, which really brings the percentage up to levels between Warhammer and Pathfinder. So all of this is to say that in 10 years, PBTA has become a very commonly played, well-known set of game mechanics. But this is about Mörk Borg and what it's doing to take this model one step further, and that is the Mörk Borg cult, which is the death metal way of saying the DM's Guild, but with ethics. So let me explain. According to the website, the cult is, quote, our sublabel for selected, approved, and curated Mörk Borg content written by fans and laid out and illustrated by us. So the game's developers will review fan submissions of content for their Mörk Borg IP, and if they pick it up, they will work with the creator of that content on proofreading, layouts, illustration, basically all of the fancy resources that indie creators don't typically have access to, and will then publish and promote that content on the front page of their website. Now, because the website downloads are free, there's no compensation for these contributions unless they decide to print the content, in which case they will, quote, reach out to the authors to discuss terms and payment to make sure that both parties are happy. Now, look, this sounds like we'll pay you an exposure, but the cult explicitly states that you can continue to sell your content before, during, and even after review. And that means you get 100% of your profits. This is way unlike the DM's Guild for D&D, which gets to rake in a massive 50% cut of your content, which they had zero creative input on just for it being on their overstuffed web store. And this isn't to say that making content from Mörk Borg is a better deal for you as a content creator, because after all, D&D is a juggernaut with lots of eyeballs on the DM's Guild. So even after they charge you for exposure, you still stand to make a bit of money for your creation. It's a pretty unbeatable business model in terms of pure finances. But if you're creating a new tabletop RPG IP, you can't delude yourself into thinking that you'll be able to mirror that same model successfully. Your game requires a lot of clout, and few games can even scratch at D&D's market share. So if you're creating a tabletop RPG, you need to focus on your game's longevity and relevance. So you have to ask yourself, how do I keep people playing my game? And this is a question I'm sure Mörk Borg ask themselves, and it seems they've come away with a smart answer. You start with your core team of writers and illustrators. You keep them involved and paid by collaborating on a revolving door of incoming fan content, rather than having to mine the well of inspiration by yourselves to create content from scratch over and over. Your community is creating better and better third-party content to attract your eyeballs in order to get access to your talent. So which also means simultaneously attracting the eyeballs of gamers who keep seeing this Mörk Borg game pop up in their feeds, potentially driving book sales and gameplay for Mörk Borg itself. And hopefully that stirs demand for more print books, for which you already have loads of content with your trademark gorgeous art, because your team has been by your side working on upgrading fan creations this whole time. And you may even have picked up a few more passionate and committed hires along the way by doing just that. And if anyone isn't interested in creating for the Mörk Borg setting, they can still sell their own original setting content using Mörk Borg rules and then credit them to you thanks to that third-party license. So Mörk Borg is very new. This was published this year, 2020. Time shall tell if this business model works and if this game will cement itself among the greats. It requires a committed team of creatives, ongoing respect and ethical treatment of its creative community, and one hell of a unique visual branding, which this game has all of them in spades. Bloody, demon eviscerating spades. So let's deep dive into this. Say we're creating a tabletop RPG. Every game on that top played list is over a decade old, so no IP has been able to rival D&D or Vampire or Call of Cthulhu. And it's not that these classic games have better settings or better rules, because they're just convoluted as hell in both respects. They've just been in the community consciousness for much longer. So it's not enough to just have an amazing setting and amazing rules. But if we just let people hack our game with a third-party license, we essentially no longer have a central IP. You just have a central mechanic system like Apocalypse World that gets regurgitated and refined into other games. So to me, it seems like what designers of new games really need to do is focus on community building. So to actively and continually engage them to build momentum and snowball it into the tabletop community consciousness at large. And I feel like that's what Mörk Borg is doing. But this means that they really need to commit to this one game, which is something I don't see indie designers doing. They just make game after game after game waiting for something to strike gold. So Opti, you're working on Gangs of the Undercity. Tell me, how does this approach feel to you? What's your takeaway from it?
I mean, as you're describing it, it's basically a shortcut for me, because this is almost exactly how we have been thinking about doing the Subversion RPG, where we release our own stuff, but then also empower the community to write their own stuff and then bring that into our setting, right? Instead of holding fan creations at arm's length, we say, like, we'll never be able to get to all of this stuff that's possible in our world. Why don't we support the creators out there doing really, really cool stuff in our world as well? So this business model, as you were talking, I am going to be following this with great interest to see how they do things and how it works, because it's not going to be too long, within a year or so, that we're going to be doing something very, very similar.
Yeah, it seems really interesting to me, for sure. I think the big thing that interested me or really made me think like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense, was when you talked about community building. When you've got these big megaliths like D&D, and you talked about that, I think you're right. Community has to sort of be your focus. You got to get people rallying behind you and your game if you want to make inroads. But and that sounds great for game companies that make these games like Mörk Borg or like, Fragging Unicorns. But what does it, if everybody's using this model, does that make it all the harder to ever, be the standout? I don't know. That's assuming that that's something you even want. That's a different question, I think, and I don't want to go down there. But if let's assume that your desire is to be the next D&D, can you at all if everybody does something like this? I don't think so. I don't think you
honestly can. The more that I think about it, and that I've been thinking about it since I started writing this story and delving into it, I'm like, it's a really risky business model to start with, right? Because in order to keep paying your people, right, your team, to help develop fan content and make it like official licensed, stuff, but it's for free on your website, it means like you need to invest money from your book. You need to keep continually investing money from your book sales in order to pay this team so you're going to have a limited amount of fan content that you can put out. But then if you're able to if we see that this leverages into more book sales, which then leverages into more and more, that's how you start snowballing into something. Beat D&D? I don't think so. It's just not going to happen. I mean, we saw it's like 53% of what people play. We've seen what how many things are on the DM's Guild alone, and like to beat that kind of funding, it's not going to happen. So just, I would say not at all. But in order to reach that level of any kind of consciousness in the community, you have to get there first.
And as I was asking the question, I think I realized like that's the wrong question to ask. Do you want to be the next D&D? Because that's just not the right question, I think, to ask right now if you're a tabletop RPG creator. I'm not someone who wants to say that it's never going to happen, but I do agree with you in that it's not what you should be trying to do right now. Anyway,
the next D&D has already been created.
I just don't know what it.
I just don't know we don't know what it is, because D&D was a really slow burn. Right, it took D&D a long time to work its way into the public consciousness. But once it did, it's because all those people who were playing it, became the movers and the shakers in media. So now I think whatever people are playing now in 10 or 20 years is going to be the next thing. And that's why games like Mörk Borg actually are really, really cool, because all it takes is a group of people now to get excited about it, and then they will, do something with it later. We just don't know. That's a random thing. We don't know what it's going to be or who those people are going to be. Create more games. And
the question is, like what we were saying is 10, 20 years from now, are people going to keep playing your game? And the only way people play your game is if the community chooses to continue playing your game and not move on to something else. So if you are able to create a community that supports itself and keeps feeding into it, so like that feedback loop of here's some content that you can use to make your life easier, then I have more reason to want to play it.
Now, I think D&D is, again, the weird outlier, because it both has a very strong IP and a weak IP at the same time, right? Like, it's got very strong name recognition and mechanics and themes, but like its worlds are not necessarily what drives it, right? Like, so nobody who talks about D&D in the public sphere necessarily is talking about Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance or whatever. But then like you've got another game like GURPS, which I mean has been around, forever, but it's just never quite made the bridge into public consciousness, because it doesn't have a setting that's strong either. Then you've got Shadowrun, which is only strong because of its setting. I think there's plenty of room for lots of different stuff, but if you're just trying to say how do I be the next D&D, I think that's the wrong way to go about it.
I'm also seeing in chat, and I think Cliff, you can maybe speak to this about Troika. Troika apparently does a bit of this. I'm not familiar with the Troika model. I've heard that it relates to it, but I'm not sure. What do you know about it?
I believe Troika has a third-party model that's very open-ended as well. They also have a very sort of art book style approach to how games are put together. So I think thinking of Troika from looking at this game from Mörk Borg seems like a pretty significant connection to make. They're not made by the same people, but I think they're sort of vaguely in the same genre of RPG books that present the rules and the setting and the information of the book in a way that where the art style goes beyond the idea of layout to where it's almost like taking the idea of a zine to the next level. But it's really interesting to see. I actually picked up the Mörk Borg PDF this afternoon after reading through your notes, and I've been looking through it. It's really interesting to flip through. Very everything's presented very artistically. It makes it a little hard in some cases to find some of the specific game information because the visuals are so striking. And I'm not a big fan of reading black text on a yellow background, but fortunately the whole book isn't like that. And the actual like just artistic work that's gone into the presentation, I think exceeds any drawbacks from you having to look a little bit harder to see the text.
Yeah.
Cases.
Yeah, I mean the game is basically an art book, so that's why it screams for you to pay attention to it. Is what I say,
Which makes me wonder if they have like an artist on staff that's like part of the core company, right?
They do. I mean, if you go and you look at the Mörk Borg website and all of the modules that they've released that they've already worked with people on, it's to create a cohesive visual look, like D&D. All like when you have an official module or something coming out for it, like, it has a cohesive look to it. It has specific art style and layout style. They are doing the same thing with Mörk Borg. They're basically, it's a visual branding, which I think is also incredibly important for your game if you're going to try and make it something bigger than just here's an RPG that you can play and then I'm going to move on to my next design.
Right.
Anyway,
the line art does look like you can do a lot of it. And again, if they have that guy in-house and he's part of it and they're not necessarily paying him by work, you probably could get this done. The model and the way that they're doing the art does seem like it's a possible thing that you could probably do. You couldn't do a D&D book like this, right? Like you could, the level of D&D art and the kind of style of art, I don't think you could do with a D&D book.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well,
I was probably heavily intrigued by the whole death metal aesthetic.
Yeah.
My days playing keyboard in a black metal band called Tower of Babel are some of the fondest memories I have.
So look up Tower of Babel, everybody. Fine. All right. Well, time will tell if this works. Let us know what you think in the show note in the comments below, and we've got a bunch of links also in the show notes below. Like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.